immediately opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, preparing for rapid development and control of the center. An early skirmish for central influence, the knight boldly challenges the pawn's dominion. Gaining central space, by advancing the pawn aims to restrict the knight's mobility and potentially prepare a kingside attack. Excellent, black immediately confronts the pawn, forcing white to define their intentions and potentially opening lines for quicker development. Asserting central control, d4 solidifies white's pawn presence and opens diagonals for development. Challenging the central pawn immediately loosens black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses later. Aggressively challenging the knight's central presence, this pawn thrust immediately creates a fascinating pawn structure and fights for vital central squares. Retreating the knight to a passive square concedes valuable central space and allows white to build a formidable pawn presence. Opening the d-file creates immediate central tension, potentially isolating black's knight on b6. Reclaiming central space with the pawn, black aims to open the c-file for future counterplay against white's pawns. Anchoring the knight firmly on c3 initiates a structured development, setting the stage for rapid piece mobilization while simultaneously reinforcing control over the d5 square. Developing the kingside g-pawn to g6 prepares to fianchetto the bishop, creating a long-range diagonal threat and solidifying the king's position, although it does open a slight weakness on the dark squares around the king. Developing the bishop to this square prepares for kingside castling and aims to control the important central squares, while also eyeing the d5 outpost for black's knight. Developing the bishop to its natural diagonal unlocks the king's pawn and prepares for kingside castling, while simultaneously aiming at white's central pawn structure and potentially creating a strong outpost on d5. Developing the knight to a square where it supports the pawn chain and prepares to castle kingside offers robust development, while also freeing up the f1 square for the bishop. Re-establishing central influence with the knight's return to c6 aims to challenge white's pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn breaks in the queenside, while also offering flexibility for further piece development. Consolidating bishops to dark squares, this maneuver aims to solidify the kingside and prepare for an eventual kingside expansion, while also potentially discouraging black's dark square bishop development or forcing a compromise. Safely tucking the king away is a wise priority, establishing robust defensive coverage and preparing the rooks for future action. Castling diligently secures the monarch, tucking it away behind a pawn shield and initiating the process of connecting the rooks for active engagement on the open files. Initiating central pawn play, black immediately challenges white's d4 pawn and aims to untangle their pieces, particularly the queen's knight. This aggressive pawn thrust opens lines and creates dynamic possibilities, though it also risks overextension if white can effectively counterattack. The resulting pawn structure promises a sharp middle game with active piece play. A bold advance, pushing the knight back and seizing central territory, but it also opens up avenues for counterplay along the semi-open c-file and potentially creates weaknesses around white's king if black can reroute pieces effectively. Injecting dynamic possibilities to the queenside pawn structure, this knight repositions to attack the c2 pawn and simultaneously probes for weaknesses in white's defensive setup, threatening to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially open lines for black's pieces. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing for a potential queenside expansion becomes white's priority with this move. Black eliminates a key white pawn in the center, simplifying the structure. This decision opens lines for the queen and bishop on c8, potentially activating them more quickly. However, it also grants white an improved pawn on d5 and a clear central presence, which needs careful management. The knight now awkwardly sits on d3, potentially a target for further harassment. The queen repositions to eye the kingside pawn structure, while potentially clearing the way for the rook to join the central skirmish. The knight on d7 initiates a subtle repositioning, aiming to bypass the white pawn chain and find a more active square, perhaps c5 or even e5, while simultaneously preparing for the potential advance of the e-pawn. Sharpening the focus on the queen side, this redeployment aims to unpin the c3 knight and potentially target the d6 pawn's precarious foothold, while simultaneously preparing for a kingside offensive by freeing the e2 knight. Black boldly challenges white's central pawn chain, aiming to disrupt its harmony and potentially open lines for their pieces, particularly the f-pawn's newfound dynamism. This aggressive thrust injects immediate tension into the position, forcing white to carefully consider the structural integrity of their d5 pawn and the safety of their king. It's a gamble that could lead to a more dynamic, albeit potentially riskier, middle game where black seeks active counterplay rather than passive defense. Initiating a pawn storm on the king side, white boldly seeks to pry open lines and create attacking chances against black's castled king, while simultaneously challenging black's central pawn chain. Black solidifies the queenside pawn structure, establishing a solid base for future counterplay against white's central pawn mass, and preparing to contest the open c-file if white continues to push their center. Oak and elm are fighting for central territory, with white aiming to cramp black's position and restrict his pieces. The rook's arrival on the d-file suggests white's intention to challenge black's pawn on d6 and exploit the open file, potentially leading to pressure on the queen side. This redeployment aims to bolster white's central control and prepare for future pawn pushes, while also potentially creating lines of attack. It's a strategic decision that prioritizes piece activity and positional influence over immediate tactical fireworks, setting the stage for a positional battle. Black's knight now embarks on a journey, aiming to occupy the strategic square d5, a move that simultaneously prepares to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially launch an attack on the kingside if the opportunity arises. Opening a critical central file now might invite unexpected counterplay. White is gambling on disrupting black's kingside structure before it solidifies. Opening a central file presents a double-edged sword, and black's recapture on e5 immediately leverages this newfound pathway for the queen's rook to become an active participant in the ensuing skirmishes. The d-file, now clear, suggests a potential shift in focus for white's remaining queen, and we must be mindful of how the queens might dance or collide. This action also aims to unlock the bishop on g7, preparing it to exert pressure along the h8-a1 diagonal, which could prove crucial in outflanking white's potentially cramped kingside. Harnessing the initiative, white repositions their bishop to create immediate pressure on black's central pawns and potentially disrupt their carefully constructed pawn chain. Reclaiming central space and preparing to challenge the open d-file, the bishop embarks on a sortie, seeking to activate its influence and support its knight's potential foray onto d5. Securing the king behind its pawns creates a vital safe harbor, subtly preparing for potential central skirmishes or long-term maneuvering without immediate kingly concerns. A strategic regrouping is underway, subtly shifting the rook to a more active file, aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure and perhaps prepare for a future kingside assault by the knight. Retrieving the knight from the kingside, white aims to reposition it to a more active square, perhaps d2, to support a central pawn push or defend against black's increasing queenside pressure. The initial idea was to block the d-pawn and launch a kingside attack, but black's solid pawn structure and active pieces have neutralized that plan. Now white must reevaluate their strategy, focusing on developing their pieces harmoniously and preparing for a potential pawn break in the center or on the queen side. The knight's journey suggests a shift in white's attacking intentions, seeking new avenues of pressure while consolidating their position. Suddenly, the black queen retreats, not to a defensive outpost, but to a square that activates the queen's rook on f8, subtly preparing a potential queenside pawn push or even a repositioning maneuver to support the central pawn advances, hinting at a desire to break free from white's increasingly cramped position. Pushing the d-pawn to d6 injects immediate spatial pressure, aiming to restrict black's queenside development and potentially crack open the center. White boldly sacrifices a pawn for dynamic initiative, creating potential weaknesses around black's king by drawing the knight away from its defensive post and opening lines for white's rooks. This aggressive pawn thrust forces black to make a decision about its central pawns, potentially leading to further tactical complications or positional concessions. liberating the queen's bishop from its defensive post on the G7 diagonal. A vital initiative begins as the bishop anchors itself on C6, preparing to contest the now open d-file. White aims to exploit the backward d-pawn and create space on the queen side, potentially launching a pawn storm. Instantly, black addresses the pressing threat on the king side and aims to liberate the knight from its passive station, though this might slightly weaken the kingside pawn structure. Challenging the pawn chain's integrity, this exchange aims to disrupt black's harmonious piece development and seize control of central files, potentially creating weaknesses around the soon-to-be-exposed king. By recapturing the bishop, black decisively solidifies their central control, transforming a temporarily open d-file into a strategically potent outpost for their knight, while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside, aiming to exploit white's somewhat passive development. Initiating a pawn storm on the queen side, white aims to crack open black's defensive structure and exploit the potential weakness on the c-file. This bold push forces black to confront the advancing pawns directly, potentially disrupting their coordination and creating new targets. The strategic intent is clear: to gain space and initiative in a position where the central tension has somewhat subsided. Opening the c-file presents an immediate challenge, as the pawn structure has fractured, creating both opportunities and weaknesses. Unlocking the c-file now becomes paramount, leveraging that pawn advance to shatter black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create a critical weakness for future exploitation. Reclaiming the central file after the pawn exchange, black positions the rook to pressure the now exposed d6 pawn. This active placement aims to disrupt white's pawn chain and create potential for counterplay along the open files. Unlocking the c-file pressure becomes paramount, and this knight maneuver boldly asserts dominion over the central expanse, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially fork the king and rook if the defense isn't meticulously managed. Unlocking the pinned bishop's potential by relocating it to a more active diagonal, aiming to challenge white's strong central pawn chain and potentially prepare a kingside attack. White repositions the queen, shifting it from an exposed central square to a more secure position on the second rank. This retreat might seem passive, but it prepares for future defensive maneuvers and potentially redirects the queen to a more active file later. The queen on e2 also supports the d6 pawn, a key outpost, and helps to reinforce the kingside. Bringing the bishop back to the queen's side aims to bolster the defense of the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential counterplay along the now open c-file. Targeting the undefended queenside is the aim here, forcing black to commit his pieces defensively and potentially opening lines for the white rooks. Consolidating the king behind a pawn chain while preparing for future defensive maneuvers often proves sound, especially when the opponent's queenside initiative appears stalled. Securing the advanced pawn with the queen reshuffles the defensive priorities, forcing black to confront the encroaching white army before it becomes overwhelming. Unleashing the pawn's aggressive potential, black initiates a bold thrust to shatter white's queenside pawn structure and create immediate attacking prospects. A bold commitment to severing the pawn chain, this thrust aims to exploit the exposed black king by forcing a crack in the pawn shield, even at the cost of surrendering central control. Suddenly, the queen's activation breathes life into black's position, challenging the tightly controlled center and preparing to exploit the newly opened diagonals with unexpected aggression. Seizing the initiative, white sacrifices a knight to shatter black's pawn structure and open vital lines leading towards the weakened monarch. The immediate explosion on the kingside, orchestrated by the opportunistic knight fork, creates a chaotic situation. Black must now navigate a dangerous minefield of tactical possibilities, where the pinned pieces and exposed king present significant vulnerabilities. White's aggressive advance has effectively transformed the positional landscape into a tactical brawl, demanding precise calculation from both sides. The sudden material imbalance and the disruption of black's defensive harmony suggest a dramatic shift in fortunes. A bold gambit to recover material, but the newly exposed queen suddenly becomes a tempting target for the advancing pawn chain. Unleashing a knight to the dangerous central outpost, forcing the king into a potentially compromised position and creating immediate threats on the G7 bishop. A desperate attempt to escape the oncoming storm, but the king's sanctuary is compromised, its escape square severely restricted by the looming knight. Seizing the now undefended queen with your own in a tactical skirmish, this recapture directly addresses the immediate material imbalance created by black's daring pawn push, fundamentally altering the board's dynamic by simplifying exchanges and paving the way for a potential endgame where white's advanced pawns might become a decisive factor. Reclaiming the bishop fundamentally alters the material balance and injects a much-needed defensive resource into black's somewhat exposed kingside, setting the stage for a complicated defense. Recapturing the pawn opens up the f-file, a crucial corridor for the rook to re-enter the fray and put immediate pressure on the now exposed black king's defenses. Capturing the knight opens a crucial file, but simultaneously exposes your king to relentless pressure along the newly cleared pathway. The rook now prowls down the d-file, eyeing the exposed black king and the vulnerable pawn structure. Reclaiming the bishop to a central square allows it to defend against further pawn advances and potentially participate in counterplay. Sacrificing the rook opens a deadly discovered attack, exploiting the exposed black king and forcing mate or significant material loss. The king finds a much-needed sanctuary behind the pawns, an attempt to escape the immediate threats and reorient after the dramatic exchanges. Seizing the now unprotected pawn on a7 immediately improves white's material advantage and further restricts black's already limited pieces, a classic endgame maneuver where material superiority often dictates the outcome. Reclaiming the diagonal for the bishop offers a glimmer of counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's seemingly dominant material advantage by activating a previously passive piece. Seizing the open file with the rook immediately after the exchange offers a potent offensive platform, threatening to penetrate deeply into black's weakened queenside and exploit the exposed king. The bishop's relocation to e3 presents a final, desperate attempt to create an outpost or a pawn sacrifice to unblock the a7 rook. But it's a futile effort as white has already secured a crushing positional advantage and is poised to exploit the exposed black monarch. Unleashing a devastating discovered attack, white seizes the opportunity to disrupt black's already compromised defenses and threaten immediate material gain with the queen. The bishop repositions, eyeing the d-file, ready to support any advance or defend against a potential breakthrough while simultaneously preparing to retreat if necessary. A subtle repositioning to eye the vulnerable pawn structure, seeking to exploit the exposed black king once the queens are gone. Repositioning the rook to the open file to contest control of the d-file and offer resistance against white's advancing pawns. Initiating a decisive king hunt, the rook's sortie forces the black monarch into an exposed position, paving the way for further material gains or a swift checkmate sequence. Hoping to escape the relentless pressure, the black king tucks back into the corner, but this repositioning offers little respite from the looming threats. Anchoring your pawn structure with this move solidifies control over the crucial light squares and prevents the opponent's bishop from finding an active outpost on g5, while simultaneously preparing to advance the pawn chain. The bishop retreats, seeking refuge on the open file, but the immediate danger to the king remains, and this passive placement offers little active defense. Reclaiming central influence and preparing for a knight's active foray, this move aims to reroute the piece towards the queenside or potentially the kingside, depending on black's subsequent responses, while simultaneously solidifying white's pawn structure and seeking to restrict black's bishop on a4. Reclaiming a tempo and repositioning the bishop to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's recently advanced knight and potentially disrupt the coordination of the white pieces along the kingside. A strategic retreat, repositioning the rook to a more active file, aiming to support the pawn's advance and potentially create attacking opportunities on the kingside. Hoping to draw the knight into a less active position, black repositions the rook, anticipating an eventual pawn push. Suddenly, the knight leaps into the fray, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit the exposed king.